these indictments, and it was plastered all over the news at the same time the shooting had occurred. We also understand, and we discussed this previous to the interview, that the indictments came out during the Munich Security Conference. Why was it so important to have the indictments come out during these periods of time? And are these indictments anything that has any type of substance to it?
Well, as I know you already know, there's no substance to it. But the timing, the other thing that it's timed to coincide with is the exposure of the corruption behind the investigation of Donald Trump. That the Mueller investigation from the beginning was a fraud. It was based on a fraud that was this dossier compiled by a British intelligence operative, Christopher Steele. The timing with Munich, the fact that it came out at the same time as this shooting in Florida, the momentary distraction from it. But if you take it from the top, this investigation is falling apart. They have nothing. They have a few indictments for people lying to the FBI. And if you talk to the FBI, you're going to be indicted for lying to the FBI because that's the way they do these things. They have the Manafort and Gates indictments, which in my way of thinking are another complete fraud. The guy makes money in Ukraine and moves it to bank accounts in the United States, and somehow that's money laundering. And if you understand who Manafort is, you understand why he was targeted. Same thing with Flynn, another complete batch of nonsense. So if you take it from the top, what's really going on here? And I think it's become more clear recently, Dave, than it's been at any time in the last year and 4 months or so, or 6 months that it started. This whole thing was designed to prevent, first of all, to try and prevent a Trump election victory, because it was cooked up by British intelligence and brought to the United States by the Clinton campaign, the FBI, and the CIA to derail the Trump presidential campaign. Once he won, it was designed to destroy his presidency. Why? Whatever legitimate complaints people have about Trump, and I have some myself, what he does represent is a break with the old establishment, a break with the geopoliticians who believe that this is a unilateral world where Wall Street and London make the decisions. Trump is not part of that. And the fact that he wanted to talk and work with Putin, that once he met with Xi Jinping, he decided it's necessary to have a cooperative relationship with China. The breaks with the free trade agreement, the Paris Climate Conference, these were assaults on the fraudulent and dangerous geopolitical designs of the Bush and Obama administration. And so what do we see? The Obama administration, with Obama himself involved, with Clapper, his director of national intelligence, Comey, his FBI director, Brennan, the CIA director, working directly with the highest levels of British intelligence to concoct a story that Trump is somehow a puppet of Putin. And then when you see things like the unfolding of the Munich Security Conference or the National Threat Assessment 2 weeks ago in the U.S. Congress, all you're hearing is Russia's a threat, China's a threat. Little Marco, your senator from Florida, said the reason China's a threat is because they have an aggressive infrastructure program. Well, I wish we had an aggressive infrastructure program in the United States. Why is that a threat? So this is the essence of things, and add to that one really important factor, which is that the whole bubble system of financial fraud that was never addressed after the 2008 crash, the perpetrators of that crash were never put into prison or brought before justice. They're about to cause a bigger crash than before. And as their system's collapsing, they want to make sure they've got complete and total control. If it means false flag terrorism, if it means wars, if it means pulling the plug and taking away everybody's savings, they're prepared to do that. And so I think it's in that context that you have to see how desperate they are to try and pull off this 13 Russian agents working in a troll farm, as though that's some big revelation that's going to prove the case that Trump is run by Putin.
Now, what is the reason that they're so concerned with China and Russia? I know you said that, they have this infrastructure, but what other reasons are there that they're so worried that they're demonizing both of these countries so hard?
Well, I think it comes down to two things. One is the fact that the dollar system is inherently unstable because of the huge unsustainable volume of debt that's been created to bail out the banks and insurance companies and corporations since 2008. And the second part of that is that on the horizon, there's a potential for another system. Now, I'm not of the opinion, and I know Mr. LaRouche doesn't believe this, that we're about to have a sudden switch from a dollar system to a petro-yuan system. It's not going to happen like that because the Chinese are doing a very deliberate set of moves to not provoke a collapse, in spite of the idiocy from our bankers and from the Western financial circles. However, what they're showing is that you can generate credit without creating unsustainable debt. They're showing that you can use existing debt for the purposes of funding infrastructure development, and that you can invest in physical economy without causing boom-bust cycles. And so we're seeing a potential of a new system which throws out all the axioms that have been used by this Anglo-American financial system to suppress nations' development and to make them totally dependent on America's military power and the financial might of this empire, which is no longer financial power. It's actually collapsing. So the threat is a systemic threat. Now, it's our belief that the Chinese are serious when they say, look, why don't you work with us? We don't want a Thucydides trap where one nation supplants another nation as the most powerful. We'd rather solve problems in a win-win situation. But that's rejected as just rhetoric by people like McMaster and the people who are Rubio and others who are going after China, foreign affairs. It's the old gang. It's the old Trilateral Commission types, the Brzezinski types, the geopolitical types who are saying that China is trying to take over from the United States and subvert American democracy, and that the Russians are in on it also. It's nonsense. Their system is bankrupt because they're so damn stupid and corrupt, but they're prepared to go to war to protect that bankrupt and corrupt system.
So do you think that they're mostly afraid of losing control of the currency system? Because right now, the United States, and they're in control, if they're in control, they have the ability to use the currency system to place sanctions on different countries, make other countries do what they want. They can steal a lot of money from the system. I mean, there's 21 trillion missing. Nobody knows where it is. You think that's what they're very nervous about, that's going to be taken away from them. And if it is taken away from them, they lose power.
Well, I think we have a pretty good idea where some of that 21 trillion went. But you're absolutely right. That's the point. What is it that keeps this system going? It's the fact that they're allowed to continue to buy and sell worthless financial assets at markups to sustain completely ridiculous values on their books. And they do it by taking the free money from the central banks that's given to them to buy and sell these financial instruments, whether they're stocks and companies that make no profit, whether they're bonds, junk bonds. And as long as that volume of liquidity comes into the banking system, they think everything's fine. The problem is it's insolvent. There's a difference between liquidity and solvency. And all you need is a series of bad bets or a trigger of hyperinflation or deflation, and the whole thing collapses. The people always talk about the $20+ trillion of U.S. government debt, but there's now $14 trillion of corporate debt, which has grown, I think, 58% in the last 4 years under the quantitative easing policy. Now, where did that new credit that went into these banks and their blue chip corporate clients, where did that money go? Went into the stock market, went into the bond market. It didn't go into physical economy. And so this is a system that's overripe for collapse. Now, if we wanted to do it properly, if Trump had everything together in terms of a team that would work with him and follow it through, he could push through a Glass-Steagall bankruptcy reorganization that would immediately force the investment houses to eat their bad debt or let it write it off over time. You could do it in a way that would be orderly. They don't want that. They're not going to give that up. So you're absolutely right. They're holding on to the power to keep us under control as debt slaves to a financial system which is bankrupt.
Are you nervous that they will try to attempt to maybe have a huge false flag event or try to assassinate Trump? Right now, they have nothing on Russian collusion. The 13 indictments most likely are going to lead to nowhere because they can't bring the Russians over here, and there's really nothing there at all. And right now, they're not getting what they want, and the investigations, the Uranium One, the Clinton email investigation, all this is continuing. Are you worried that they're going to try something much, much larger to stop him?
Well, there are two things to worry about. One is that there could be an assassination attempt against Trump. The other thing is that they could blunder us into a nuclear war. General Harold Kuyat, who's the former chief representative of the German Bundeswehr, the German army in NATO, did an interview last night, and he said, look, you could very easily have a couple of mistakes lead to nuclear exchange that would not stop until there was no one left on the planet. And I think anybody who is at all aware of the gaming going on right now in terms of lowering the nuclear threshold, the idea that we can go to low range or low yield nuclear weapons and use them to knock out a fleet or something like that. This is all insanity. And the fact that it's being discussed as theoretical possibilities is the greatest danger. Now, in terms of the question of Trump's life, the Kennedy question is a clear one. John Kennedy was killed because he didn't go along with the strategic policy, which included one provocation after another against the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union doing a tit-for-tat response, nearly leading to nuclear war. And Kennedy, after the Cuba Missile Crisis, tried to open a back channel. Secondly, he was moving against the Federal Reserve. The Fed was not allowing credit to get to the steel industry or any other industry. And Kennedy, in June of 1963, issued treasury notes and was prepared to issue tens of billions of dollars of treasury notes directly. So they wouldn't go through the Federal Reserve to be marketed by the money center banks. And that was a coup, or a potential coup, against these powerful private interests. And I think those two things, the fight against the strategic policy of mutual and assured destruction and many, many proxy wars, and the power of the Fed, that's what Kennedy went against, and that's what cost him his life. What's Trump saying? Trump's idea of working with Russia against terrorism goes up against a 20-year operation, 30-year operation, going back to Kissinger and Brzezinski, to use terrorism against Russia and China. The whole Al-Qaeda, ISIS operation. Why do you think Michael Flynn was targeted? Because among other things, Flynn understands and was blowing the whistle on U.S. arming of terrorists in Syria, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda networks. So it's very possible that if they could get to him, there might be an attempt on Trump. But I think the other thing is that these guys are not that bright. You unleash a nutcase like the Bibi Netanyahu, or unleash the Saudis in conjunction with Israel in an attack on Iran, and we could be looking directly at World War III.
Right now, I mean, I see a lot of different similarities between Kennedy and Trump. And what's very interesting is Trump has Andrew Jackson hanging in his office, and Andrew Jackson campaigned on getting rid of the central bank, and there was an attempt on his life, and he actually, was able to get rid of the central bank. Do you think ultimately Trump is moving in that direction, that same type of direction?
Well, we do know during the campaign, he talked about how hedge funds are useless, that the bailout was a big mistake. The speculative economy is no good. We've got to go back to production, construction. He talked about all those things, none of which can happen under the current Federal Reserve System. Now, is he going to do that? I couldn't tell you. I think having people like Gary Cohn and Mnuchin, the two Goldman Sachs alumni, hanging around his economic policy decision-making is a real negative in that direction. They're not going to allow something like that. So I think what's necessary, I mean, let's take it back a step. Why is Trump surrounded by so many people from the establishment, from the swamp that he said he was going to drain? It's because he's trying to find a way to stay in office when the other grouping in the swamp is militantly trying to get rid of him, using the Russiagate and the argument that Trump is unstable, he's mentally incompetent, he's a moron, and so on. They're using that to try and destroy his presidency. So he hasn't had a chance to actually fulfill any of the longer-term pledges that he made when he ran. So it's hard to know exactly where he's going. But that's why I think there are two things that have to happen. If I may get into that right now. Look, the president has to talk to the American people and tell them Russiagate is an attack on them, their decision to elect him instead of Hillary Clinton. It's not an attack on Trump. It's an attack on the American people. It has nothing to do with a military or economic threat from Russia or China. It has to do with the bankruptcy of the people who ran things under particularly Bush and Obama and would have run it under Hillary. I think secondly, then, he has to say to the American people, help me to elect people to the Congress, I don't care what party, but people who will work with me to take on these questions, these strategic questions, and the financial question, including, and I think he should come out and say he's going back to calling for Glass-Steagall, back for a huge infrastructure plan, if necessary, with federal funds outside of the federal budget, which is the way you have to run these infrastructure projects. If he were to do that, then the question would be, would the American people respond? And I personally believe, and I believe this to the depths of my being, that the American people would respond just as they did during the election campaign. If he made it clear that the reason he's under attack has nothing to do with corruption or fraud or collusion or meddling or any of that, but sustaining a bankrupt system, and he's going to put that bankrupt system into bankruptcy, then I think he would get the support. So that's the way out of this. If he doesn't do that, then the drip, drip, drip of the mainstream media is eventually going to bring him down.
I mean, to your point, why doesn't he just, come out and say that, but also dump all the information that he has about who really committed the crimes, the real information that really what happened with the Uranium One deal, all the documentation, because I'm pretty sure with the NSA and access to everything, he must have a lot of this information. He must know a lot of this stuff.
Well, one tip-off was that he told Mike Pompeo he should meet with Bill Binney. Now, Bill Binney was the NSA whistleblower who exposed the fact that the NSA killed his program, which could have tracked terrorists without doing mass metadata collection. And when Binney tried to confront the NSA on this, he was not only thrown out, but the FBI raided him. He was attacked. And Binney was one of the team, the forensic team, that looked into this argument that the Russians hacked the DNC, and their conclusion was it was an insider leak. It couldn't have been a hack. So Trump knows that, and Binney was sent to meet with Pompeo. Now, to show you what kind of an idiot Pompeo is, what did he say to Binney? He said, "Did you go to the FBI and the NSA with this?" Now, how could he not know? Here's the head of the CIA. How could he not know that the FBI and the NSA have been out to destroy Binney since he exposed their corruption, which meant we could not track any of the terror networks that were involved in 9/11? So I think Trump does know. The question of what he's doing, I think that there's a clear strategy that may not be coordinated, but people like Trey Gowdy and Nunes and Senator Grassley are going after the Clinton networks. They're going after the Obama networks. They're peeling the onion, but they're doing it in the right way because they're making the connection to the British. And Dave, let me just take a second to say why this is so important.
Sure.
Most Americans don't realize that the corruption in our intelligence agencies comes from the role of the British in working with Wall Street networks and setting up the FBI and the CIA in the first place. The Office of Naval Intelligence, the OSS, these were all organized during World War II by British intelligence. You look at the Vietnam War. What was that all about? We were trying to defend the British and the French Empire. Look at what the situation with Iran and Afghanistan for many, many years. That was the area of the great game, the British combat with the Russian Empire over who would control India, the Indian Ocean, and so on. So the intelligence community was largely organized and trained by British methods. And British methods are what? They're imperial divide and conquer. They're based on the idea that the world is a zero-sum game, and one group will win and everyone else will lose, and we'd better be the ones to win. Now, the specific importance when you come up to the question of the current strategic crisis, the individual who's the linchpin for this, it doesn't mean he's the most important person, but he's in the center of it, is Christopher Steele. It's not just the dirty dossier on Trump that he wrote and then was brought to the FBI, was brought to it was paid for by the Clinton campaign and so on. The story has come out of the key role of his former boss in organizing this, Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6. Dearlove was the one who told Steele, go to the FBI, and then Steele went to McCain and other people to get the documentation into the hands of the FBI. But Steele was also working with GCHQ, the command headquarters of British intelligence signal corps, the cyber warfare division. And it was Hennigan, who was the former head of GCHQ, who in 2015, that is, in June 2015, when the Trump campaign was just getting underway, Hennigan came to the United States and said, look, we're picking up strange signals of Russian collusion with Trump. So this is where the story started. But then let's go back one more step. And this is the one that's not getting covered yet because the memo has not come out. That is a strange character named Jonathan Weiner, who was a top aide to former Secretary of State John Kerry. Weiner is an old friend of Christopher Steele. And Weiner worked with him on international organized crime task forces and things of that sort. And so when Christopher Steele was writing memos in 2014 about Russia and Ukraine, he was passing them on to Weiner, who passed them on to the old Hillary Clinton hands in the State Department. And so here you have what came out of that. Well, the State Department, through Victoria Nuland, was involved in the coup in Ukraine, working with neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And Steele was defending the neo-Nazis and attacking the Russians. And when the Russians acted to protect the people in eastern Ukraine, we put sanctions against them, which is really the origin of the policy today, the anti-Russian policy. Supposedly Russia's invading Ukraine, they invaded Crimea. All these are fraudulent stories. But all of this came from British intelligence. Now, one final note on Sir Richard Dearlove. He was the guy in 2001, 2002 that had his operatives draft the document that was given to Tony Blair, which said there's no doubt that Saddam Hussein has nuclear weapons and ICBM capabilities to launch nuclear strikes that could hit London within 45 minutes. That dossier was presented to Colin Powell, who made a total ass of himself by presenting that before the United Nations. but that was used to launch the whole Iraq war in the first place. That's who Sir Richard Dearlove is. So he's someone who's handled these dodgy dossiers before. So when you get that picture, it makes it more clear than ever that the attack on Trump is that he is breaking with a century of British geopolitical manipulation of the United States. And that's the threat. It's not just money. It's not just power. It's that the basis of ruling an empire itself has been challenged by Donald Trump, whether he knows it or not. And that's what the real Russiagate story is.
So basically, he's destroying the empire that they built. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, and he's getting a lot of help from them because they're such idiots. They ran a financial Ponzi scheme which couldn't sustain itself.
You mentioned Ukraine, and we see things heating up in Ukraine. There have been protests where they want Poroshenko out of office, and we're starting to see a lot of things heat up in Ukraine. You think this is another flashpoint?
Oh, this is a very, very dangerous one, and I was just talking with Mrs. LaRouche about it today. What's happening in Ukraine is that the parliament voted a law that Ukraine should reintegrate eastern Ukraine into the nation. You know, eastern Ukraine under the Minsk Accord was given a separate status, and the Minsk Accord, which was guaranteed by Russia, Germany, France, and the United States, was supposed to allow a certain degree of autonomy for the provinces in eastern Ukraine, which are largely ethnic Russians. Now, the parliament in Ukraine said, we're not going to abide by this. We're going to take them back, if necessary, by physical force. This was almost defeated in the parliament until the same neo-Nazis who ran the Maidan Square demonstrations showed up with clubs and guns in the parliament and intimidated enough parliamentarians that the bill passed. Now, the Russians protested, but not a voice was lifted from the Germans, the French, or the Americans, even though this violates the agreement that led to the ceasefire 3 years ago. Now, today, Poroshenko, he went to the Munich Security Conference and gave a raving speech against Russia, that Russia's about to attack the West, we need to extend NATO, we need more lethal weaponry, and so on. Today, he announced that he's going to support this new bill, which calls for the reintegration, by force if necessary, of eastern Ukraine into Ukraine. If that happens, if there's an attack, I mean, first of all, the Ukrainian army is not exactly a powerful force, even though we've given them some new weapons. They couldn't defeat the insurgents who were largely militia forces in eastern Ukraine. But if there's a full-fledged invasion of eastern Ukraine, you could have a Russian response. Now, the Russians aren't going to overrun Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania. They'll probably just flatten the Ukrainian army. But at that point, who the hell in the West cares about the Ukrainian army? It will be used to ratchet up the sanctions against Russia and to say that we have to be more aggressive in moving NATO to the Russian borders, put more nuclear weapons in Europe, and so on. So you're absolutely right. This is a very serious flashpoint, and it's one that was envisioned years ago by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said that Ukraine is one of the keys to breaking the power of Russia. The other is the arc of crisis on the southern border of Russia of Islamic fundamentalism. So these geopoliticians, unfortunately, their ideas last even when their bodies decay. And of course, their minds decay when they draft these crazy plans.
I mean, they could use this. I mean, they've tried before where they said, Russia was invading Ukraine. They told us this many, many times, which it never turned out to be true. But they could use this, and they can use some type of false flag, once they start the attack, that Russia actually, bombed the capital or did something.
Sure.
And they could call for war because Ukraine is not really part of NATO right now. But NATO would come in and assist Ukraine because there's a lot of different countries. The United States is there. I think France is in there. The UK is in there. They have soldiers training other soldiers within Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces. And we can see this really heat up where this is where they could get their war that they want.
Oh, yeah. And they believe they could do it as a limited war. which is another part of the insanity in their thinking. But when you talk about NATO, NATO is essentially the United States and British and French nuclear weapons. The Bundestag and the German parliament just put out a report on the German military preparedness, and they said the 5 submarines of the German Navy don't function. They're not seaworthy. The divisions of the army are poorly equipped and poorly trained. The other major power militarily in NATO is Turkey. And the Turkish leadership has very much turned away from NATO because they were being set up by NATO to be the fall guy in a bigger war in the Middle East with Syria and Iraq.
So let's just move out to the Middle East right now, to Syria. The U.S., there are soldiers still in there. They're still paid mercenaries and moderate rebels and the Syrian Democratic Forces. It looks like a lot of it has been pushed down by Russia, where they really have control of the country now. It looks like the Syrian armed forces actually have control of the country right now. People are coming back into the country. And it looks like the last part is the Kurdish region, where the Kurds are allowing the Syrian army into their region, which then what would that do with the United States and the deep state who are holding out in the Kurdish region? I mean, what would be the reason for them to even stay there? I mean, if you really look at it, why is the United States in Syria right now? The Islamic State is pretty much beaten. The Kurds are saying that they're part of sovereign Syria. And why is the United States still there? And why hasn't Trump said, let's leave this area?
I think the CIA is completely freaked out that their assessments were so wrong about Russia. They said Russia would get bogged down in a quagmire. They couldn't defeat the terrorists. And that's, of course, what they wanted. They wanted another Afghanistan. And instead, they found out that the Russians had developed some very effective modern weapon systems, but they also worked well with the Syrian army, because the problem that we've always had, the United States in Iraq and these wars, is we didn't have good intelligence on the ground because we destroyed the intelligence of the government. And so we were going in there as the pig in the poke. We didn't know what we were doing. And the Russians came in and very efficiently crushed ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, the other part of that, of course, is that the CIA was involved indirectly, possibly directly, in training and building up the ISIS forces. And so this was a big defeat, a big black eye for the Obama policy. Now, there's one other factor here, though, which is that what's the line now on Syria? The big threat is Iran. And this is coming from where? It's coming from Netanyahu and from the Saudis. And the biggest danger is not a Turkish-Syrian war or Turkish-Iraq war. If it were just left up to Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria and the Russians, they could work it out. And if Trump were involved in it, it could be worked out. You throw in the crazies in Israel and the equally loony military faction in Saudi Arabia, and you have the possibility for an explosion there, whether it's the Kurds that are used, whether it's the Israeli support of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's a mess. The only way to address it is to free President Trump from this absurd story that if he works with Putin, it's because he's controlled by Putin. Free Trump so he can sit down with Putin and say, look, let's get our generals in here and work out a plan to deconflict the whole area. And then let's get the Chinese and others in here and come up with a reconstruction plan. Now, there are people in the U.S. military who are very appreciative of the coordination with members of the Russian military leadership. There is discussion underway. That's because of Trump and Putin. But there are many people who want to sabotage that, because the old British plan for the Middle East is what? Break up the sovereign nation states. And Dave, this goes back to something we were talking about earlier. Countries like Iraq, Libya, were toying with the idea of moving away from the dollar-denominated financial system anyway. So they were destroyed. They were obliterated. And I think that the people who remain now in power in these countries have no allegiance to an Anglo-American financial system. And so that makes an added incentive for these crazies to blow the whole thing up. And by the crazies, I mean the Anglo-American elite.
I mean, they went in there purposely to make sure that they were using the dollar on oil purchases and making sure that countries, continually purchase the oil using the dollar. And now we can see that these countries like Syria, Iran, Iraq, they're really now dealing with Russia and China moving away from the dollar. So this brings us back to everything that's been happening here. Their financial system is breaking apart. The countries that are using the petrodollar, they're slowly moving away from it. And maybe they're using their own currency. Maybe they're like Venezuela deciding to create their own cryptocurrency, and they're starting to use other methods, and they won't be controlled now by sanctions or the dollar or by the deep state. So when this happens, what happens to the financial system? Because aren't we based on this?
Oh, sure. And there's another added element here, which is actually the positive side, which is that the people moving away from the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, London, Wall Street dominated financial system have a different approach to economics. They're investing in physical production, developing new platforms of infrastructure, cutting edge technologies, high speed rail, nuclear power, including the development of nuclear fusion, space research. These are countries that have learned from what they saw happening in the United States under John Kennedy. And also looking back to America under Hamilton's economic policies and Lincoln's economic policies, where we had a sovereign state controlling credit, opposing free trade, investing in science and technology, and having astounding rates of growth. That's what is driving the economic renaissance in China. And, all the stories coming out, China's got a credit bubble, China's making big mistakes, there's too much corruption, too much state control. We're now seeing reports on Bloomberg from McKinsey and Associates and others saying, well, maybe their system really is working. Maybe it's our system and our axioms that are flawed. So you have this new potential, and governments are orienting toward the Eurasian perspective. I was just at a conference in Berlin 2 days ago where the German government was telling African countries, stay away from China. And the African countries were saying, we're already working with them. And of course, they were also saying, by the way, how many German firms have been bought by Chinese companies? So we're in a new universe, and the ability of these neoconservatives, the Project for a New American Century types, the Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Cheney types, Kagan, Newland, all of these guys, they're living in the wrong century. Their century's over. The new century is going to belong to those nations that break with this speculative financial bubble and move toward an American system-style physical economy. And I think Donald Trump, with all the problems and everything else associated with him, Trump, when he looks at this, looks to what he's seeing from China and saying, that's better than what we're doing. Why aren't we doing that? And that's the great hope, that if he comes out and clearly delineates who's trying to stop him and why, I think the American people will support him, and we'll be able to defeat the deep state. Not without a fight, because among the other things they can do, as you were alluding to earlier, they can pull out a collapse. They can create complete financial chaos and use that as an excuse for a police state. And they still have the FISA courts. They still have the NSA surveillance. We have a surveillance state here. So there's a lot they can do to stop it. But I think the momentum internationally has swung over to this Eurasian perspective. And I'm seeing in Europe, bit by bit, European countries going to China, including Macron. Including the Italians. The Chinese are building ports in Italy and in Greece and Sweden. So, is this China taking over? Well, no, they're hiring Greek and Italian and Swedish workers and management. So I think we're moving into something that's different. It's not the new world order of George H.W. Bush, because it's out of the control of this transatlantic corrupt group of elites.
Now, the deep state, as I've seen in the past, they don't give up. They keep going. They might, their plans might not work out. They recalibrate and they try once again. And that's my biggest fear, is that, if things aren't going their way, they're going to go all out on Trump, or, keep him so bogged down with events or other things that he won't be able to do anything. Actually, nothing will get done whatsoever.
That's the big danger. But, you look at how pathetic what they're doing is. This indictment that we talked about earlier of these 13 Russians, they'll never come to trial in the United States, and Mueller knows that, so he's never going to have to present any evidence. If evidence were presented, you would find that some of these guys were actually arrested by Putin's police and charged with conspiring against Russia, working with foreign intelligence agencies. Who are those foreign intelligence agencies? These were people who were well known to the CIA. The idea that they were somehow running a troll farm that could control the minds of millions of American voters by spending $100,000 on Facebook, this is such a flimsy, concocted story that no one would believe it. But it keeps getting repeated on CNN, the New York Times, even the Wall Street Journal, Russian meddling. And so the real effect of it is to convince Americans that you can't really know what's going to happen, but we've got enemies who are out to get us, and I better just mind my own business. And that's why you need leadership. That's why you need a president who will lead. That's why you need people in media like yourself who bring these stories to people who are diligent enough to search around to find it. And I think we saw in the election campaign that people were inspired by Trump's attack on the Bush machine and then on the Clinton machine, inspired enough that he had a clever campaign strategy to win the Electoral College. And that's all you have to do under our system. So if he takes that up again, goes back into the Midwest, goes back into the South, and even targets areas of other parts of the country, like, Trump worked out a deal. The Chinese are pouring $80 billion into West Virginia into developing petrochemical and coal chemical capabilities. $80 billion into West Virginia. They've never seen money like that. They're putting money the Chinese into Montana. Imagine if the Chinese came in and said, look, you want us to help you build a high-speed rail system on the East Coast? So I think Trump has a lot of cards to play. But you're right. We're dealing with a bunch of powerful people who are literally clinically insane. And that just has to be repeated. They're these great titans, couldn't do anything without having servants who know what to do for them. And if we can break a large chunk of the American people out of apathy and out of demoralization, I think we can win the fight. And the other thing that we have going for us, Dave, is a lot of people in the boomer generation and the generation below that, Generation X, are seeing their children and grandchildren destroyed by this degenerate culture, which is also a product of these same elites. And I think the opioid crisis is reaching epidemic proportions. I think the social networking is turning a bunch of semi-autistic people loose on society. And I think parents and grandparents who care are going to have to step in and say, we've got to stop this. And it's got to be shown how this is part of the same strategy that goes back to Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, the Brave New World plan of how you can drug the West to create slaves of people.
Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Well, I'll make available to your listeners the articles I've just written on the British hand behind Russiagate and the neocon crazies pushing for war. If you want to see those, send me an email at harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com. And I have gotten many emails from your listeners before, and I'm very happy to communicate with them. And the other place they can go is to larouchepack.com, where you can see every day new videos uploaded, articles, including that's where my blog is. So, but the best place is just write to me directly, harleysch@gmail.com.
Harley, once again, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on the spotlight.
It's my joy to do it, Dave.